My name's Alex, and I'm 32. Every year, Thanksgiving at my mom's house is the same. It's not the Norman Rockwell kind of Thanksgiving, with warm laughter and shared stories. No, ours is more like a twisted reality show where everyone plays their assigned roles, and I'm always cast as the screw-up. This year, I almost convinced myself to skip it, but tradition, guilt, or maybe just a morbid curiosity got the better of me. So I found myself parked outside Mom's place, the same peeling crooked shutters greeting me like a bad omen. I sat there for a good 10 minutes, steeling myself for the inevitable chaos. The second I walked, it was like hitting a wall of noise and tension. Mom was already in her voice sharp as she berated my younger sister, Sarah, for bringing the wrong kind of cranberry sauce. Sarah, bless her soul, just stood there clutching the jar like a life preserver. Dad was glued to the football game, yelling at the TV as if the players could hear him. And then there was Mark, my older brother, leaning against the counter with that smug smirk that always seemed permanently plastered on his face. Well, he drawled. If it isn't the prodigal son, decided to grace us with your presence this year? I forced a smile and mumbled agree, setting the pie I'd brought on the table. Mark, of course, didn't miss the opportunity to jab. Still flying solo, huh? No wife, no kids? What's the plan, little brother? I ignored him and headed to the kitchen to say hi to Mom. She barely looked up from the stove. You're late, she said, stirring something aggressive. Traffic, I lied, even though I'd been sitting outside for ages. Dinner wasn't even ready yet, but I already felt exhausted. This was how it always was. Mom's house had this way of sucking you into its vortex of dysfunction, and every Thanksgiving felt like stepping into a time machine where nothing ever changed. Dinner at Mom's is less about and more about navigating a minefield of passive-aggressive comments and thinly veiled insults. We all took our usual spots at the table, like it was some kind of sacred ritual. Dad at the head, Mom next to him, ready to pounce with a guilt trip at a moment's notice. Mark, naturally, sat across from me, ensuring I was in his direct line of fire. The food itself looked good. I'll give Mom that, but the atmosphere was thicker than the grate. Mark wasted no time launching into his usual routine. So, Alex, he began, his fork hovering over his plate. Still picking at your food like a bird? Or did you finally learn to appreciate a good home-cooked meal? I ignored, reaching for the mashed potatoes. Looks great, Mom, I said, trying to deflect. Mom smiled faint, but couldn't resist adding, you could use a little more on your plate, Alex. You're looking thin. Are you eating enough? I'm fine, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice. Mark chuckled. Healthy? You practically disappear when you turn sideways. You know, some of us actually work out. Thanks for the advice, Mark, I muttered, not looking up. Sarah, bless her heart, tried to change the subject. So, Mark, how are the kids? Mark puffed up like a peacock. Oh, they're fantastic. Little Marky just started t-ball and he's already hitting home runs. He's got my athletic genes, obviously. And so smart as a whip. Top of her class. It's great, Mark, Sarah said, smiling polite. Mark glanced at me. But you know, not everyone has the knack for this whole parenting thing, right, Alex? I set my fork down and took a deep breath. Right, Mark, I said, because you've clearly got it all figured out. Mom intervened, waving her fork like a conductor's baton. Boys, let's not argue. It's Thanksgiving. We're not arguing, Mark said innocently. Just making conversation. Sarah shot me a look across the table that screamed, just let it go. I nodded slightly, picking at my food. But the digs kept coming. Mark dredged up the time I failed my driver's test, then the time I accidentally broke Mom's favorite vase. It was like he had a mental catalog of every mistake I'd ever made, ready to weaponize them at a moment's notice. So, Alex, he said, leaning back in his chair, what's it like living alone? Must be nice, huh? No responsibilities, no stress, just you and your frozen dinners. I clenched my jaw but forced a smile. It's great, actually. I enjoy the peace and quiet. Oh, I bet, he said, laughing. You've always been more of a lone wolf. Or, you know, just alone. Dad finally spoke up, his voice gruff. Mark, enough. Let the boy eat. Mark held up his hands in mock surrender. Just joking, Dad. Relax, Mom sighed, shaking her head. Mark, you should really be nicer to your brother. But even her tone lacked conviction. This was the pattern. Mark would provoke, I would react, and everyone else would either enable him or tell me to just take it. It was exhausting and infuriating. The tension at the table was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. Sarah kept trying to steer the conversation towards safer waters, but Mark was relentless. He seemed to revel in pushing my buttons, and everyone else just sat there and watched. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. What is your problem, Mark? I burst out. Seriously, you've been on my case all night. The table went silent. Even Dad looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. Mark, of course, just smirked. Relax, man, he said, like he was the innocent one. I'm just having fun. Don't be so sensitive. That's your excuse every year, I shot back. It's not fun. It's just you being an ass. Kyle, Mom snapped, her eyes wide. Language! Oh, come on, Mark said, laughed. Don't get your feelings hurt, little bro. It's Thanksgiving. Lighten up. I stared at the anger boiling inside. Maybe if you spent less time criticizing everyone else, I said quiet, have something better. Mark's grin faltered for a sec, then forward, his eyes narrowing. You want to talk about better things to do? Like what? Sitting alone in your apartment every night watching reruns and pretending you're happy? Mark, stop, Sarah said, her voice firm. But Mark wasn't done. You act like you're above all this, above us. But let's be real, Alex. What have you done that's so great? What do you have to show for yourself? Enough, Dad barked, slamming his hand on the table. Both of you, sit down and shut up. The room went dead silent. Even Mark didn't dare say another word. I stared at my plate, my appetite completely gone. Mom muttered something about dessert and started clearing the dishes. I stayed quiet, my hands clenched under the table. Mark smirked again, but this time there was something in his eyes. Like he knew he'd pushed too far, but couldn't admit it. I couldn't take it anymore. This wasn't a family gathering. It was a public execution, and I was the sacrificial lamb. I stood up abrupt. You know what? I said, my voice shaking. Screw this. Screw you, and screw this whole messed up family dynamic where Mark gets to act like a king and the rest of us are just supposed to take it. Mom gasped. Alex, how dare you talk like that? How dare I? I shot back. How dare you let this happen year after year? You enable him. You all do. And I'm done with it. The room was silent. Even Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear. Mark just sat there smirking like he'd won. But for the first time, I didn't care. You know what, Mark? I said, my voice steady. You're not better than anyone. You're just loud. That's it. And one day, when your kids grow up and start resenting you the way we resent you, maybe you'll figure it out. But until then, go to hell. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. Mom yelled after, but I didn't stop. I slammed the door behind me and walked to my car. For the first time, I felt like I'd finally said what needed to be said. Mark could sit on his little throne all he wanted. I wasn't going to be his punching bag anymore. I sat in my car, my hands shaking. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Probably Mom or Sarah trying to guilt me into coming back. I didn't even check. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of liberation. I was free. But as I sat there, a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Something felt off, like the night wasn't truly over. Just as I was about to start the car, the front door burst open and Mark came storming out. He didn't even bother with a coat, just marched across the driveway towards my car, his face contorted with rage. I rolled down the window, more out of instinct than anything else. What the hell is your problem? He yelled, his breath clouding in the cold air. My problem? I shot back. You're the one who's been pushing everyone's buttons all night. Oh, don't start that crap again, he said, slamming his hand on the roof of my car. You think you can just walk out like that, throw your little tantrum and leave the rest of us to clean up the mess? Mess? I laughed bitterly. The only mess here is you, Marka. You've been a self-centered prick your entire life, and everyone just lets you get away with it. Mark's eyes narrowed, and for a second, I thought he might actually punch me. You're a real piece of work, you know that? Acting like you're so much better than the rest of us. Well, guess what, Alex? You're a joke. Always have been. Better a joke than a bully, I snapped, opening the car door and stepping out. My pulse was pounding in my ears, but I wasn't backing down. We stood there in the driveway, the tension crackling between us. Mark towered over, his fists clenched. I wasn't sure if he was going to swing or just keep spewing venom, but I held my ground. Go back inside, Mark, I said, my voice low and steady. Go back to your perfect little life and leave me the hell alone. Or what? He sneered, stepping closer. You going to hit me? Go ahead, Alex. Show everyone what a tough guy you are. I didn't. My hands were trembling with anger, but I kept them at my sides. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Pathetic, Mark spat, shaking his head. You can't even stand up for yourself. No wonder nobody respects you. That was it. I didn't even think. My hand shot out, shoving him hard in the chest. He stumbled back, his eyes widening in surprise. What the hell, man? He said, regaining his balance. You don't get to talk to me like that anymore, I said, my voice shaking. I'm done, Mark. Done with your crap. Done with this family. Done with all of it. Mark's face twisted into a snarl. You think walking away makes you better than me? You're just a coward. Always have, always will be. I'd rather be a coward than a bully, I shot back. At least I don't need to tear other people down to feel good about myself. The sound of the door opening interrupted us. Sarah stepped outside, her face pale. Guys, stop it, pleaded. Just stop. This is insane. Stay out of this, Sarah, Mark snapped, not even looking at her. No, I won't stay out of it, she said, stepping us. You're acting like a maniac, Mark. And Alex, you're not helping. Both of you need to grow up. I took a step back. I'm not the one who started this, and I'm not the one running away. Good. Go, Mark shot back. Nobody's stopping. For once in your life, Mark, shut up, Sarah yelled, startling both of us. We all stood there in the freezing driveway, the weight of years of resentment and unspoken anger hanging in the air. I glanced back at the house, half expecting Mom or Dad to come out and intervene, but the door remained closed. They weren't going to get involved. They never did. Mark finally broke the silence. You walk away now, Alex, and don't bother coming back. You're not part of this family anymore. Good, I said, turning towards my car. Because I don't want to. I got in and slammed the door. I didn't look back as I drove away, but as the house disappeared in my rearview mirror, a pit formed in my stomach. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Something was. I could feel it. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced, replaying every insult, every accusation, every smug look from Mark. I should have felt liberated from the years of toxicity, but instead, a gnawing sense of dread settled over me. Halfway back to my apartment, my phone buzzed. I pulled over and checked the message. It was from Sarah. You need to come back. Something's wrong. Please. My chest tight. Something about those 3 words, something's wrong, sent a chill down my spine. Sarah wasn't one to exaggerate. If she was texting me like this, it had to be serious. I hesitated, the cold air seeping through the cracked window. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, to leave the dysfunction behind. But Sarah's plea echoed in my mind. I couldn't abandon her. Not again. With a sigh, I turned the car around and headed back to Mom's house. The house looked different this time. The warm glow from the windows that had seemed so inviting earlier now felt ominous. As I stepped out of the car, an eerie silence hung in the air. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. I called out, Sarah? Mom? Dad? But there was no answer. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved through the house. The living room was empty, the remnants of dinner still on the table. The laughter and chaos from earlier were gone, replaced by a heavy stillness. Then I heard a muffled thud from the back of the house. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I considered turning around but then I remembered Sarah's text. If she needed me, I wasn't going to let her down. I followed the sound to Dad's study. The door was slightly open and a dim light spilled out, casting long shadows on the walls. I pushed it open slowly. Mark was standing by the desk, his back to. He was holding something, a picture frame. His shoulders were slumped, his head bowed. For a second, I thought he was crying, but then he turned around and I saw his face. It wasn't sadness. It was rage. You came back, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Of course you did. You couldn't just leave it alone. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice shaking. Where's Sarah? Where's Mom and Dad? Mark laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. He slammed the picture frame down on the desk, shattering the glass. They're gone. Just us now. What the hell are you talking about? I said, taking a step back. Gone where? Mark didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his fists clenched. You always thought you were better than me, didn't? Mr. Perfect. Always the victim. Poor little Alex. I never thought that, I stammered, my voice trembling. Mark, where are they? You're the reason this family's broken, he snarled, his voice rising. You, with your holier-than-thou attitude, your constant running away. You're the one who doesn't belong. Mark was unhinged. This wasn't the brother I grew up with, the one who loved to tease but never crossed the line into outright madness. Something had snapped in him, and I didn't know how to fix it. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs broke the tension. Mark's head whipped around, his expression shifting from rage to something dark. Without thinking, I bolted for the stairs, pushing past him as he yelled after, Don't you dare go up there, Alex! But I didn't listen. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart pounding. Light spilled from under one of the bedroom doors. I threw it open. Sarah was sitting on the floor, her back against the bed. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Alex, she whispered, he's lost it. What happened? I asked, kneeling beside her. Before she could answer, Mark's voice boomed from the hallway. Get out of there, Alex, now! I stood up, positioning myself between Sarah and the door as Mark appeared in the doorway, his face contorted with fury. She texted you, didn't she? He spat. She had to drag you back here to play the hero. You always need to be the hero. Mark, stop! I said, my voice firm. Whatever's going on, we can fix it. Just calm down. There's nothing to fix, he screamed, stepping into the room. This family's broken, Alex. It's been broken for years, and it's your fault. You and Sarah, always ganging up on me, always making me the bad guy. Nobody made you the bad guy, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You did that all on your own. Mark lunged at me, but I was ready this time. I sidestepped, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her to her feet. Get out, I whispered. She didn't hesitate. As we ran, I caught a glimpse of Mom and Dad huddled in the corner of the room. They weren't yelling. They weren't trying to stop us. They just stood there, frozen like spectators at a car crash. "Do something!" Sarah screamed. "He's losing it!" But Mom just shook her head, her hands fluttering uselessly. Dad stood stiffly beside her, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He didn't say a word. "Mom! Dad, help him!" Sarah shouted again, but neither of them moved. Finally, Mom muttered, "They're brothers, Sarah. They'll sort it out." "Sort it out?" I shouted, backing away from Mark. "Are you serious right now? He's out of control and you're just standing there?" "Stop yelling at your mother," Dad said finally, his voice low and sharp. The front door was in sight when Mark caught up to me, grabbing my arm and yanking me back. I turned, swinging wildly, and my fist connected with his jaw. He stumbled back, more surprised than hurt, and I used the opportunity to shove Sarah towards the door. "Go!" I shouted. "Now!" She hesitated for a split second, then nodded and ran outside. Mark recovered quickly, his face a mask of fury. He came at me again, but this time I was ready. The fight was raw, messy, and desperate. Two brothers finally unleashing years of pent-up resentment and rage. But in the end, it wasn't about winning, it was about surviving. As I stood there, breathing hard, Mark slumped against the wall, glaring at me with hatred in his eyes. For the first time, I saw him for what he truly was. A man broken by his own bitterness, lashing out at the world because he didn't know how to fix himself. "I'm done, Mark," I said, my voice quiet, firm. "You can't hurt me anymore." Without another word, I turned and walked out the door. Sarah and I went to a diner. We slid into a booth, the smell of coffee a faint comfort in the aftermath of the chaos. "I don't think I can go back," she said soft, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't," I replied. "You don't owe them any. They're still Mom and Dad," she whispered, her hands shaking around her coffee cup. "No," I said firmly. "Parents protect their kids. They don't make excuses for abuse or stand by while it happens." Her eyes filled with doubt. "What do we do now?" "We cut them out," I said, taking a steady sip of coffee. "Completely? It's the only way." Later that night, I blocked Mark's number, then Dad's, then Mom's. The weight of their toxicity replaced by a strange calm. Cutting ties wasn't easy, but it was the first step towards freedom. And for the first time, I felt like I could finally move forward. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be scars, both physical and emotional. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was finally free from the expectations, the manipulations, the endless cycle of hurt. The price of freedom was high, but it was a price I was willing to pay. Story 2. I was forced to live in a camper when my father evicted me from the house. However, because he wants to go camping, he subsequently tries to steal that camper. He gets arrested when I contact the police, and he begs me to dismiss the accusations. Hello everyone! Prior to starting today's video, I need your assistance. One of the greatest ways you can help us out is to subscribe, since we've observed the channel is losing some of its popularity. It's simple, free, and helps us continue to provide you with amazing content. Your assistance is much appreciated. Together, let's continue to build this channel. Many thanks. Let's begin the video now. I'm tired of being treated as if I possess nothing. My dad used to believe he could take everything he wanted, but that is no longer the case. What are your thoughts? Reddit. It was not easy living under my dad's roof. It felt like there was a never-ending power struggle going on. He had a knack of making himself the center of attention. He would eventually either take everything for himself or behave as though I owed him for anything I had saved up to buy. My mother was also of no assistance. She constantly supported him, but she wasn't as dominant. "It's simply the way he is," she tells me, as if it made everything okay. I was able to tolerate it for the most part. I tried to avoid him, worked part-time, and saved what I could. My objective was straightforward: eventually get over it and move out. However, my father was unable to leave anything alone. When he removed the one item for which I had worked the hardest, my automobile, it was the tipping point. My passport to freedom was that vehicle. It was a cheap old Chevy Caprice. Nothing fancy or new. However, I adored it. I invested every available dollar to make it function properly and spent months fixing it up. To me, it was more than simply an automobile. It was self-reliance. But my father thought otherwise. He didn't consider it his. He thought he could use it whenever he wanted to. He didn't even ask the first time he took it. It was simply gone when I got home from work. A few hours later, he rolled up as if it had never happened. For a while, I borrowed it. Casually, as if I should have been appreciative, he said. After that, I made an effort to establish limits by telling him he couldn't handle it without asking. It didn't matter to him. After another of his joyrides, I discovered the car scratched up a week later. He dismissed it when I confronted. "The vehicle is old. Stop acting like it's worth something," he said. At that point, I began to conceal the keys. I believed I was safe until I woke up one morning to find the car had vanished once more. I'd had enough. I reported it stolen to the police. My dad lost it when the police arrived. In front of the officers, he was standing there shouting it. "You reported me to the police? Your father is me." I didn't recoil. "My car was taken by you without my consent. Dad, That's called stealing. It's not stealing if it's family, he shouted back. His voice cracked. The cops didn't arrest him, but they made him return the car to him. Though it wasn't about the car, it was about the fact that I stood up to him for days after he sulked around the house, muttering under his breath about how ungrateful I was. Then one night, he called me into the living room. "You're done here," he said coldly. "You call the cops on me after everything I've done? You've got 2 weeks to pack your stuff and leave." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You're kicking me out because you stole my car?" He didn't even blink. "My house, my rules. If you don't like it, there's the door." My mom just sat there, not saying a word. She wouldn't even look at me. By the time my dad kicked me out, I'd already been working full-time for a few months. I wasn't making a fortune, but I'd saved enough to start thinking about my options. I didn't have enough for an apartment, and I wasn't about to couch surf indefinitely. That's when the idea of buying a camper hit me. It wasn't a luxury, but it could be my own space. No landlords, no roommates, and most importantly, no parents. After some late-night scrolling on classified ads, I found one that seemed promising. I figured it was my best shot at having some stability. After meeting the seller, checking it out, and haggling a bit, I handed over most of my savings and towed the camper to my uncle's property. With nowhere to go, I turned to the only family member who ever had my back. My uncle. He's always been the odd one out, the guy who didn't put up with my dad's crap. When I told him what happened, he didn't even hesitate. "You can park that camper of yours in my yard," he said. "Stay as long as you need to. Just keep the lawn mowed and don't burn the place down." It wasn't ideal, but it was better than dealing with my dad. The camper wasn't much, but it was enough. But my dad, he couldn't leave it alone. The moment he found out I was living in a camper, it was like a switch flip. He wasn't satisfied with kicking me out. Now he wanted to take the one thing I had left. Of course, my dad couldn't let me have even that. The moment he found out about my setup, he started acting like it was a crime for me to own a camper. "You're living like some kind of drifter," he said with his usual sneer. What he really meant was, "Why do you have one and I don't?" Then one day, he showed up at my uncle's house out of nowhere with my mother, which was already weird because he and my uncle don't get along at all. My uncle's always been treated like the black sheep of the family. And honestly, he's pretty open about how much he can't stand my dad. Anyway, my dad pulls up in his car, gets out, and goes straight to my camper without even saying hi. I step outside and he's just standing there looking at my trailer like he's inspecting. "Nice setup you got here," he says. But it's not a compliment. It's that passive-aggressive tone he always uses when he's about to start something. "Yeah, it's working for me," I reply, casual. "I've always wanted a camper. Like, this would be perfect for some camping trips. You know, me and your mom have been talking about getting into that." Then he casually says, "So I'm going to take it camping this summer." And that was the beginning of the whole mess. I laughed, thinking they couldn't possibly be serious. "No, this is my house. I'm not letting you borrow it." My dad's expression suddenly transformed. "What do you mean, no? Your father is— I shouldn't have to ask you to borrow anything like this." "Well, you don't have to ask," I remarked, trying to keep my tone light, "because the answer is no." That's when my mom started in with the guilt trip. "Where are your parents? We reared you. And all we're asking for is a little courtesy." I was getting irritated. "Now, you didn't raise me so you could steal my stuff anytime you feel like it. This is my house. I'm not simply going to let you tow it off and utilize it like it's yours." My dad, of course, wasn't going to let it go. He began to pace while murmuring that he was ungrateful to me and that he was shocked that his own kid would in such a manner. My mother simply stood there, shaking her head as if I had somehow betrayed them. I tried to cut the talk short by saying, "Look, there is no dispute about this. The trailer won't be taken. The narrative is over." My dad went in first, but they finally departed. A final dig. "You've evolved," shaking his head, he said. "What happened to you is unknown to me." Yes, I had changed, but didn't they cause it? I endured years of manipulation, rejection, and being treated as though nothing I possessed was ever really mine. Everything accumulated. He was unable to notice it. Naturally, they had made me into the entitled, self-centered person they were. So be it, if it made me the bad guy in his eyes. I assumed things would settle down after that. However, I was completely mistaken. Almost every day, my dad would call me and play the trailer as if we hadn't previously discussed it. "You're being self-centered," would say. "What exactly are you doing? You don't require too much room." After a time, I stopped returning his calls. But my mother began messaging me instead. "Your dad is quite angry. Why don't you just give it to him? You're not really using it for anything significant." But it had nothing to do with the trailer. It has to do with control. The thought of my possessing something he desired but was unable to have made my dad furious. And he became more eager to wear me down the more I rused. I had my uncle's support the entire— bless him. Don't give in. We were grilling burgers in the backyard one evening when he mentioned that. "He will never return it if you allow him to take it once." I said. I know. That's why I'm refusing to back down. My uncle gave a nod. Excellent. And I'll take care of it if he comes here again. He is not allowed to make decisions about my property. I knew my dad well enough to know he wasn't going to give up, but I also felt a bit better knowing my uncle had my back. He would find a different approach to achieve his goals. He did. As expected, I woke up a few weeks later to the sound of someone playing outside the trailer. I could make out the dim glimmer of a flashlight moving around, and it was late, most likely after midnight. As I got out of bed and looked out the window, my heart began to race. He was there. My dad squatted near the hitch as if he were attempting to connect the trailer to his vehicle. It seemed unbelievable. In fact, he was attempting to take the fucking thing. What the heck are you doing? I pulled on some clothes and rushed outdoors. After a moment of inaction, he got up and attempted to like it didn't happen. Oh, he responded. I was just checking something, as if I were foolish enough to fall for it. Verifying what I broke, how to take my trailer. He began to borrow it defensively, as he always does. It didn't sit well with me. I responded, you're not borrowing anything. Before I contact the police, get out of here. He made an effort to argue, but I refused to back down. He eventually rushed off, muttering that I was ungrateful and that I would later regret treating him in this manner. I went into full lockdown mode the next morning. I fitted motion-activated lights, purchased sturdy locks, and even purchased a low-cost security camera from Amazon. My dad would need a lot of courage and a crowbar to acquire the trailer if he wanted it. Although it was the first actual altercation over the trailer, it was undoubtedly not the last. I knew my father well enough to know that he would not tolerate this. He was obstinate and would not give up until he achieved his goals or destroyed all relationships in the process. And me, I had no intention of giving up. This was where I felt protected and at home. And I wasn't going to let anyone to take that away. Not him in particular. I believed that my dad's preoccupation with the trailer had reached its peak after the whole midnight sabotage. However, he wasn't finished. He made the decision to call in reinforcements. The remainder of the family. And believe me when I say that my extended family is a chaotic, gossip-loving machine. They'll find a way to make things worse if there's something to dispute. My mother was the first to. The following day, she immediately launched into her guilt trip routine when she contacted. You know, she added, your father was just trying to be kind to us. Her voice was phony and charming. A camping trip would be a great way for him to relax after all the stress he's been recent. Why must you be so challenging? I only chuckled. In the middle of the night, Mom, he attempted to take my trailer. Not being kind is what that is. That's insane behavior. Oh, she replied, don't be too dramatic. You're going overboard. Correct. Because it seems like I'm overreacting when I defend myself. I hung up after telling her I didn't want to hear it, but it wasn't the end of it. After a few days, I received an unexpected call from one of my relatives. Hello. In an attempt to appear informal, they said. Thus, I learned about the trailer issue. What's happening? What's happening? Already irritated, I said, my dad believes he can take my stuff whenever he wants, and I won't let him to. My cousin made a little sound as if they were weighing all sides of the dispute. He is, after all, your father. You ought to lend it to him, don't you? My blood pressure went up. It's my home, first and foremost. Second, even if I didn't reside there. He can't just accept it, though. Why do people here act as though I'm the villain? They laughed like it was no big thing and said, calm down, man. I'm only suggesting that you give it some thought. After all, he's your father. I understood then that my dad had most likely been phoning all of the families. Like the golden kid, he is making up a tale about how I was a self-centered idiot who didn't want to support his hardworking, impoverished parents. It was typical of him to turn everyone against me and make himself the victim. However, I had no intention of complying. A few weeks later, during a family gathering, the genuine confrontation took place. At that point, I had completely moved into the camper in my uncle's backyard, and things were beginning to return to normal. When my uncle proposed that I park the trailer close to the edge of the land for the reunion, he chose to host it on his property since he really appreciated having me around. It wasn't a horrible concept, I thought. I was able to have my own place and avoid sharing a room with my parents in particular. It was also an opportunity to display all of the camper's improvements that I had made. Everything appeared to be in order once I parked the trailer and set everything up. In addition to lighting the grill and building a fire pit, I also shared some jokes with cousins I hadn't seen in a long time. For a little period, it seemed as though this family get-together may go well. However, as my dad arrived, everything went haywire. He didn't even greet. He simply strode up to my seat and began to attack. He exclaimed loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You really brought the trailer here. You'll lug it out here to show it off, but you couldn't let your old guy take it." I inhaled deeply while attempting to maintain my composure. "Dad, That's my trailer. I may use it whatever I like. Putting up his palms, he said, unbelievable. You have no regard for family. We just asked for a small request and you were unable to do. By this time, several more family members had begun to congregate, ostentatiously enjoying the food while obviously listening in. Naturally, my mother got in since she can't help but make things worse. Can you see what we're up against? She shook her head as she said, we've taken care of him in every way, and we receive this gratitude. I went crazy. For me, everything. My entire family is now against me after you attempted to steal my trailer and took my car. For I will not allow you to walk all over me. Yes, excellent parents. After a brief period of silence, one of my cousins, bless her, spoke out. She crossed her arms and added, to be honest, he's right. For years you two have been mistreating. Perhaps you should quit. My mom appeared to have been smacked, and my dad's cheeks flushed. Muttering that they were no longer respected by the family, they hurried away. My trailer was plastered in mud when I got home a few days after the reunion, as if someone had driven a truck through the yard and splattered mud all over the sides. Additionally, I saw that the tire tracks stopped just in front of the trailer and led straight to it. I asked my uncle whether he had noticed anything over the phone. He simply laughed. Yes, your father visited earlier. You humiliated him during the reunion, he was complaining. I assumed he would attempt something foolish. How come you didn't stop him? I inquired. I was occupied in window watching. But don't worry, I've got it on camera, he replied. It turns out that the entire incident was captured by a security camera my uncle had placed some time ago. Like a middle-aged youngster, my dad was spinning his tires in the mud and revving his engine as he pulled into the yard. Despite my anger, I couldn't help but giggle at how pitiful it was. I then displayed a fictitious security notice that said, surveillance in progress. My uncle agreed that it was probably essential, but he also found it funny. With all of my dad's activities, I was not going to take any chances. In case my uncle attempted something different, I made the decision to relocate the trailer closer to his house. My uncle is constantly watching out for me. I believed we could go one step farther. Although it sounded a bit drastic, I was enticed by his promise to assist me in installing a GPS tracker on. He displayed to me a GPS tracker that he had purchased online. He clarified that this device is waterproof and will notify your phone if the trailer moves more than a feet. We set up and tested the tracker beneath the trailer the next afternoon. It operated flawlessly. In a sense, my camper was a fortress. My dad never really apologized for any of it. Which is funny. He was fully justified in his opinion. My dad obviously had a couple more tricks in his sleeve, but I thought the mud act was as low as he could go. There was silence for a time after I secured the trailer with strong locks and motion-activated lights. Too silent. I was accurate when I said that it seemed like the quiet before the storm. My uncle was pacing the yard with his phone and appearing more irate than I had ever seen. When I returned home after doing errands around 2 weeks later, what's happening? As I exited my vehicle, I inquired. He said, you'll never guess who showed up here while you were away. I had the answer before him. Dad, may I guess? My uncle shook his head and muttered, yeah, he also brought a tow truck this time. For a moment I froze. Are you serious? An actual tow truck? Oh, I'm being serious. In a voice brimming with rage, my uncle spoke. He yelled at the driver and attempted to pull the trailer off the property, that it was his and that you had allowed him to steal it. I was starting to see red now. What did you do? I took my shotgun outdoors. Matter-of-factly, replied my uncle. Naturally, it wasn't necessary to utilize it. When I told the tow truck driver what was actually happening, he immediately fled and refused to be involved. However, your father began to scream that I was a traitor and that the entire family was against him. Traditional. Dad, it's always someone else's fault when he doesn't get his way. I was still furious when I went inside after unloading my goods. I realized that if I didn't confront this head on, it would never end. So I gave him a call. Dad, hello, I exclaimed, hardly controlling my rage. Would you mind telling me why you arrived at Uncle's place today with a tow truck? He said, oh, don't start with me. You ought to have just given me the trailer. If you weren't being so incredibly self-centered, I wouldn't have to endure all of this. Selfish? I chuckled, but not in a joyful way. I'm the self-centered one, and you attempted to take my house. Do you hear yourself at all? He stated something that made it acceptable. Therefore, it's not steal. Furthermore, you're not really making use of it for anything significant. If you truly wanted to, you could live somewhere else. He had previously attempted to appear as though my trailer was unimportant, but it still annoyed. I answered, you don't get to choose what matters to me. You're also not taking the trailer for the last time. I'm going to call the police if you come here again. Even if you're my father, I don't care. After that, he had nothing else to say. After the call, he finally hung up on. I tried to cool off by sitting there for a bit, but it didn't work. I told him to stop several times, but he never understood, or worse, showed no concern. My uncle was sitting on the porch that night. I informed him about the call as I collapsed into the chair next. Your dad has more enthusiasm for drama than a reality TV personality, I promise. He went on to say, I'm considering calling him and telling him that he's not allowed on the property. It would be entertaining to see him go crazy, even if he didn't listen. It might not be a terrible idea. Even if it sets off his narcissistic nerve, at least it would convey a message. My uncle smiled. Yes, it will definitely set him off. However, some people want a plain explanation. I'll make the call if you let me know whether you're in. After my dad was barred from my uncle's, I hoped that everything would eventually settle down. My dad was not allowed anywhere near the trailer, according to my uncle. My dad appeared to have understood the message for a time. No phone calls, unexpected visitors, or fresh drama. The situation seemed almost too fantastic to be real. It was, of course. You never know what will happen with him, so I'll keep you informed if anything else does. Update. Okay, so this is a follow-up to my last article in which I mentioned that my uncle had barred my dad from his property due to the shit he had done, because my dad wasn't finished. He outperformed himself somehow, and he went all the way this time. He took the camper. Yes, exactly. I was really out of town when he took. This is how it transpired. I thus had to leave town for job. Just a few days. Nothing major, and before I went, I made sure everything was securely locked away. I even requested that my uncle watch over the camper while I was away, since, let's be honest, I wasn't very concerned. After being banned, I assumed my dad wouldn't have the courage to try any. I was mistaken, boy. My phone alerts me to movement detected by the GPS tracker app the first night I'm gone. The trailer is moving. I initially believed it may be a bug or something. However, I recognized my dad when I launched the app and noticed that my trailer was traveling down the highway. He had to be the one. I immediately contacted my uncle. Hello, did you relocate the camper? No, he responded in a perplexed tone. Why? As it's no longer there, I shouted. It's halfway to town, according to the GPS. He slammed his coffee mug down, and I believe I heard it. That bitch's son. It must have been taken by him. It turns out that weeks earlier, I was unaware that my dad had stolen an extra set of keys. In order to grab what he believed to be his, he had been playing the long game and waiting for me to leave. Uncle didn't think twice. Make a police call. There, I'll see. I dialed 911. Furthermore, it's not as easy as you may think to explain that your dad took your camper. But the dispatcher was really laid back. I informed her I had the title and GPS data to establish my own when she asked for proof. Are you acquainted with the suspect? She inquired. Yes. My blood was boiling as I shouted that. It's my father. She seemed to require a moment to comprehend that, as evidenced by the pause. All right. Officers will be dispatched to stop the trailer. Don't go up to him personally. Yes, as if I was going to overlook it. I gave my uncle a call back and informed him of the camper's location based on the GPS. After he picked me up, we began our own investigation. We spent what seemed like an eternity following the GPS signal. My uncle continued saying things like, I can't believe the nerve of that man, while my heart was racing. Finally caught up. My dad's automobile was pulling my camper along a back road as if he had just purchased. I ordered Uncle to wait before he pulled up and blocked him in. The police were close following, and I didn't want to take the chance of making matters worse myself. The flashing red and blue lights did indeed whiz by us a few minutes later. They halted. The moment my dad pulled into his driveway, he appeared so arrogant, as if he had just accomplished the greatest theft of all time. I got out of the truck as we approached the police. Already my dad and the cops were fighting. The trailer belongs to my son. He was shouting this while wildly swinging his hands. You stole it from a property where you were prohibited without ask. Do you also believe that's borrowing? To keep me from approaching too closely, the officer held out a hand. Do you have this trailer's proof of ownership, sir? I showed them the GPS logs and gave them the title. I own it. He took it. The cop looked at my father. Do you own any documentation proving your ownership or authorization to use this trailer? My dad's face was turning redder by the moment as he stuttered. The trailer is for a family. His father is me. I am therefore authorized to utilize it. Sir, the officer didn't appear impressed. Without express consent or evidence of ownership, this is seen as stealing. Kindly move away from the car. When the handcuffs were removed, my father went insane. Are you really going to jail me for using my own son's trailer? He yelled. Indeed, sir. Calmly, the officer said. The family is being ruined by you. As they cuffed him, he screamed at me. I gave you everything and reared you, and you treat me like this? They were putting him into the patrol cruiser when my mother ran out of the home. What's happening? Why are you taking him into custody? She let out a scream. She turned on me right away once the police gave her the rundown. How could you harm your father in this way? He had no malicious intent. No, mother. My voice was solid as I said. He intended to grab what wasn't rightfully his, and I will no longer allow him to do it. The calls began coming in after the arrest. Everyone urged me to dismiss the accusations, including my mom, aunts, and cousins. He had no intention of hurt. My mother broke down on the phone. What this is doing to him is beyond your comprehension. No, Mom, I responded steadily. I know precisely how this is affecting. He's dealing with the fallout from his acts for the first time in his life. He is your father, though, she sobbed. I am not his prop. I am his son. I lost my temper. I'm not going to drop the charges. She ended the call. She hasn't gotten back to me since. My dad ultimately entered a guilty to stay out of prison. He was required to make restitution and pay a large fine. The family and he plead. But what do you know? I've had enough of them. Officially, I've stopped talking to my dad. No more communication. I have enough money stored up. And now I'm packing up my heading off and permanently leaving this place. I'll finally have the independence and tranquility I've been battling for. Whether I want to move or settle down somewhere, it's okay if my family thinks I'm selfish for defending myself. I'm not turning around. Story 3. This narrative has a title. My life was destroyed for years by my parents' covert usage of my credit card. It was upsetting to learn my family's secret later. Hello, everyone. Prior to starting today's video, I need your assistance. One of the greatest ways you can help us out is to subscribe, since we've observed the channel is losing some of its popularity. It's simple, free, and helps us continue to provide you with amazing content. Your assistance is much appreciated. Together, let's continue to build this channel. Many thanks. Let's begin the video now. My buddy insisted that I share my experiences, even though I've never been one to divulge personal details. He remarked that someone else going through a similar situation could find my tale helpful, so here I am. I had the persistent impression as a child that I didn't truly belong. My parents weren't particularly affectionate or warm. They attended to the necessities: food, clothing, and a roof over my head. However, it was the end of it. They would get upset with me if I asked them questions or didn't comply with their requests. This is how you pay us back for everything we've done for you. For everything, it was their preferred line. It didn't matter whether I didn't agree with them, received a poor grade, or couldn't use the money from my part-time work to help with a family expenditure. Their trump card was that statement, and it was effective for many years. It held me in check. But I saw things that didn't make sense for one even as a child. I didn't resemble any of the other family members. My mom was a little redhead, and my dad was tall, blue-eyed, and blonde. Then there was me, brown-eyed and dark hair, often being questioned if I was adopted by strangers. My mother would dismiss it with a laugh, citing genetics and distant cousins whenever I brought it up. I was a child, so I didn't bring up the fact that it didn't add up. The unequal treatment became more apparent as I grew old. No matter what I did, my parents would always find a way to condemn me. They pretended that my misbehavior at school was a reflection of their own shortcomings as parents. It became a lecture about how I was squandering their sacrifices if I failed to complete a task or had a C on an exam. I had learned to keep my head down and not draw attention to myself by the time I was a teenager. It made life a little easier, but it didn't stop the incessant criticism. I dreamed of attending a distant college after high school. Although it wasn't feasible financially, I wanted to distance myself from them as much as possible. I didn't want to take out large student loans because my part-time work didn't pay enough for living expenses and tuition. There was a caveat to my parents' promise to let me stay at home. I had to pay rent. Now you're an adult. We're not operating a free hotel, my dad added. Because I didn't want to give them another excuse to hang me over the edge, I didn't protest or act like a freeloader. Therefore, despite balancing a part-time job and a full academic load, I paid them rent each month. It's clear now that they were only taking advantage of me to make more money. I didn't spend my rent money for home costs. It funded my dad's weekend golf outings and my mom's shopping binges. In the meantime, I was surviving off of ramen noodles and questioning whether I had made a mistake by remaining there. Even in those days, I saw that they always seemed to have money for absurd things. My dad would brag about updating his newest technology, while my mom would bring expensive purses and fashionable shoes home. Although it didn't add up, I assumed they were simply careless with their money. I didn't understand they could not have been using their own funds at all until much later. When I needed my birth certificate to complete some job papers, everything changed. I assumed it would be in the file cabinet in the office, where my mom had stored critical documents. I saw it as soon as I began looking through the files. My name was on a big envelope. They were there when I opened adoption documents. My heart began to race. As I read them, I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I had never heard the names of my birth parents before. For what seemed like hours, I sat going over the documents again. I didn't feel upset about my adoption. Not yet, anyhow. The realization that they had deceived me all my life struck. Later that evening, I confronted my mother about it, and her response just made matters worse. She didn't say sorry or give me an explanation for why they didn't tell me. Rather, she became defensive. She responded, "We gave you a better life. You weren't even wanted by your biological." Her remarks were profound. The untruth wasn't the only thing. It was the way she weaponized my adoption. I felt as though I owed her for saving me. I was at a loss for words. My father said that I was being unappreciative. I'm not grateful that I've been misled my entire life. It was more than I could handle. That night, after packing my luggage, I crashed at my friend's house. I knew I couldn't stay there, but I had no idea where I was going or what I was going to do. The days that followed were a haze. I had taken what little money I had earned from my part-time work and enough clothing to last me a week. Jason, my buddy, was really kind when I crashed on his sofa, but I could see it wasn't a sustainable option. I kept thinking about the adoption paperwork in the interim. My biological parents were who? What made them abandon me? What was the reason for my adopted parents' deception? I wasn't sure if I wanted to break off all contact with them or face them again. I relived every conversation I'd ever had with my parents on Jason's couch. My dad once forbade me from going on a school excursion because I had unintentionally left the television on. My mother once scolded me for using the money I earned from my part-time job to buy new shoes rather than groceries for the family. They have always treated me like a burden, as if there was a debt associated with every action I took. I was struck by the realization. In reality, I was never their son. They accepted my responsibilities, not a loved one. The betrayal of learning about my adoption after I moved out was already terrible enough. However, it was made worse by my parents' reaction. They made no effort to express regret or provide an explanation. Rather, they pretended that I was the issue, as if I ought to have simply expressed my gratitude and gone on. However, I was unable to go on. My questions grew as I gave it more attention. The rage was always simmering under the surface. However, the adoption was no longer the only factor. It was all of it. I was regarded like a burden for years, as though I owed them for needs. Everything returned in a flash. I remember laying awake one night on Jason's couch and gazing up at the ceiling. I continued going over all the instances in which my parents had been strange with money. Even though I hardly had enough to pay my own bills, they would coerce me into helping out. In the meantime, they flaunt their latest acquisitions, none of which ever made sense. How could they live well off of my labors and whine about money? It wasn't directed at me, and I was unable to let it go. I was sat there contemplating my A flashback came to me. My parents had requested me to co-sign several documents shortly after my 18th birthday. They said that because I was now an adult, they required my assistance with anything little, like insurance papers or a family phone plan. At the time, I didn't give it much thought, but suddenly everything began to make sense. It dawned on me then, what if it was more complicated? What if they weren't the only ones spending the money? I made the decision to look up my credit report. I had no idea how to accomplish it. However, I discovered a free credit check website after doing a little Google search. Half expecting nothing unusual, I entered my information. But when the results appeared, I was filled with nausea as I looked at the computer and scrolled through the strange loans and accounts. I had never taken out a loan, obtained a credit card, or even leased a car. I had a terrible credit score. Initially, I assumed there must have been an error. Identity theft could have occurred, but not from them. After I began examining the specifics, everything became clear to me. The purchases and the dates matched items I had noticed about the house as a child. My dad's new automobile, the TV they purchased for the family, and even the living room furnishings. It wasn't an error. They were the ones. My signature had been forged. For years, they had opened accounts and taken out loans using my name and identities. Now everything made sense, and I felt nauseous. I thought I was out of breath. This was more than a fabrication regarding my adoption. It was a scam. I had no idea that they had ruined my financial future. Jason must have seen something was off since he approached and inquired about the situation. I presented the report to him. I scanned the list of accounts with trembling palms. He blew a soft whistle. "Dude," he continued, "this is bad. You should consult a lawyer." I gave a nod. How could I begin? I had been robbed by those who were meant to look after. I was left to clean up their mess after they had deceived and tricked. Even though it was painful, I knew Jason was correct. Who would advocate for themselves if I didn't? The following day, I began to collect proof. I looked over all of the financial documents, emails, and texts I could locate. I compiled a list of every bogus account and compared it to the items my parents had purchased throughout the years. There was no denying the trend. They had accumulated debt in my name while I was still in high school, using me as their personal piggy bank. Even the money I earned from my part-time work had been used to pay expenses I was unaware were mine. Every new find as further evidence how their act. I realized I couldn't handle this alone when I had a better idea of the locating a lawyer was the next step. I located someone who specialized in instances similar to mine, even though I didn't have a lot of money. After hearing everything, she concluded that I had a compelling argument. She wasn't surprised, but she was astonished. She clarified that we may pursue them for fraud and identity theft, and perhaps bring a civil lawsuit to recoup losses. I knew I had to finish, even if it seemed overpowering. "Regretfully, this occurs more frequently than you may imagine," she noted. You make a compelling argument, though. We can go after this. I felt as though a burden had been lifted when I heard her say that. Getting the proof was only the first step, but I wasn't going to let them get away. The next step was to file the police report, which was one of the most difficult things I have ever done. It seemed unreal. It made everything so genuine, not because I didn't feel bad about it. In addition to being poor parents, my parents were also crooks. My complaint was taken by a professional but obviously uneasy officer. When it's family, it's always difficult, he remarked. It wasn't even close to being tough. My attorney assisted me in filing a civil claim when the police launched an inquiry. I realized there was no turning back after I submitted the police complaint. I wasn't anxious or questioning my choice. I wanted to keep myself safe. Yes, but I also want retribution. They had spent years telling me what I purportedly owed them, how I should feel, and how I should behave. No more. They would have to deal with the repercussions of their behavior, and I was in charge this time. I informed Jason about the news when I returned to his place. As usual, he was encouraging, but I could sense that he was concerned about me. Are you certain you're prepared for this? He inquired. Things will become nasty. I said, it's already messy. I'm not going to back down, though. The next 2 weeks saw a rapid escalate. My attorney assisted me in sending stop and desist letters to the creditors, while the police launched an inquiry. I had to contact skeptic customer service representatives repeatedly to explain the matter, but they didn't seem to care. Even though it was tiring, each stride seemed like a step forward. Cleaning up the mess they left me in wasn't all I was doing. I was taking back my life. They were at my parents' house within a week, asking them all kinds of questions. I pictured their expressions when the police showed up. How? They must have rushed to find reasons to justify their actions. Before I knew it, my phone rang. On the other phone, my mother's voice sounded urgent, almost panicked. What are you doing? Her voice cracked as she asked, your folks are where? We looked after you. Everything will be ruined by you. I didn't think twice. Everything is already damaged by you, I said in a chilly tone. You misled me. I was stolen from by you. Now is not the time to play the victim. Suddenly, as if a switch had been flicked, her tone changed. Anger had taken the place of the phony regret. She said, you're an ungrateful little brat. Without saying anything else, I hung up. I would no longer allow her to control me. The emotional blackmail and guilt trips. Now, it didn't work on me. I had finished their games. Ultimately, the best choice I've ever made was to file that report. It started me on the road to taking back my life, but it didn't make everything better right away. Despite everything my parents had taken from me, they were unable to take away my willpower. I refused to let them continue to define who I was. I went through everything over the course of the following few days. I printed out my credit report, took pictures of the adoption documents, and began going through old texts and emails along with old financial records. I found a mortgage statement for a house I had never seen or owned in my name. Under my name, my parents had obtained a loan, which they said was for an investment I would make in the future. They even falsified the documents with my signature. This was more than simple negligence. Using my name as a financial scapegoat was a calculated. I had yet another financial mess to clean up after the payments had long since fallen behind. The extent of their deceit was astounding, but it was now evident that this was a component of a more extensive manipulation scheme. They arrived at Jason's apartment a few days later. I knew they were there without even having to see them. My mom's voice was loud enough to hear through the door, alternating sobbing and shouting. My dad's tone was colder, more calculated. You're tearing the family apart, he said, as if their actions hadn't already done that. My mom was begging, her voice desperate. Fix this, she sobbed. Make it right. We can work this out. I didn't even open the door. Instead, I called the cops. Watching them get escorted off the property was surreal. My dad was furious, shouting something about how I was ruining their lives. My mom was still crying, pleading with the officers to let her talk to me, but I didn't care. They weren't my problem anymore. When the court dates rolled around, I came prepared. I wasn't about to let their lawyer spin this into some sob story about how they were just trying to help the family. There was no way they were going to twist this around and make themselves look like the victims. The evidence was undeniable. I had the credit reports, the adoption papers, the forged documents, and the messages from my mom practically admitting to what they'd done. It all painted a clear picture. They had used me for years, treating me like a resource instead of a person. Their lawyer tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that they hadn't intended to harm me. It was laughed. The judge wasn't buying it, and neither was I. My parents weren't careless. They were deliberate. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they thought they could get away with it. When the verdict was read, I felt a surge of satisfaction. They were ordered to pay restitution and were found guilty of multiple counts of identity theft and fraud. Watching their faces as the judge handed down the sentence was a moment I'll never forget. My dad's smug confidence was gone, replaced by disbelief. My mom looked like she was about to cry, but for once, I didn't care. They thought they could use me, manipulate, and ruin my future without consequences. They were wrong. It wasn't just about the money or the guilty verdict. It was about standing up for myself and proving that they couldn't control me anymore. For years, they had made me feel small, powerless, like I owed them for every little thing. But now, the tables had turned. They were the ones who had to answer for their actions, and I was the one holding them accountable. That's the kind of justice they never saw coming. When things finally started to settle down with my adoptive parents being held accountable, I felt I wanted to finish one more chapter in my life. I had to find out the truth about my biological parents. Not knowing who they were, or why they gave me up, had been eating at me from the minute I found those adoptions. It wasn't simply curiosity. It was about realizing where I came from and discovering something true after all the falsehoods. At first, I wasn't even sure where to start. I got their names from the adoption paperwork, but it wasn't much to go on. I tried searching them up online, but there were too many people with the same names and nothing really lined up. Eventually, I decided to do one of those DNA tests. You know, the ones where you spit in a tube and they tell you your genealogy and link you to family. It was the best starting place I had, so I went for it. The results took weeks to come back. When they eventually did, I received a few matches with distant relatives. Nothing close, but it was enough to start piecing things together. I contacted a few of them and gave them the details of my prediction. I could see why most people were apprehensive, but I believe a third cousin was eager to assist. She mentioned that she had heard tales of a relative who had a child who had been adopted years prior. She directed me to a family that could be related to my real mother, but she didn't have all the information. I then concentrated on public records and internet searches. For privacy's sake, I discovered someone who seemed like a match after a fix. I'll give Karen a call. Additionally, she resided around 3 hours away from me in a little town. I wrote her a well-crafted note outlining my identity and the discovery I waited after that. She replied a week later. She stated she had been waiting for this day for years and that she was my biological mother. She informed me that although circumstances were difficult at the time, she had attempted to retain. She was young, had just graduated from high school, and was struggling financially. She claimed that a social worker persuaded her and my biological father to sign adoption documents, claiming that it would only be a temporary arrangement and that they would be able to reunite with me later when they discovered the adoption was permanent. It was too late. I was enraged by her message. At the system, not at her. She was manipulated if what she stated was as I was. This was not a case of oops. It was another instance of someone using someone just because they could. I had no intention of overlooking this. She readily provided the details when I asked for them. She even showed me old photos of herself and my biological father together. Seeing someone that truly resembled me was really strange. Karen inquired whether I would be open to meeting in person after we exchanged texts for X. I concurred. We agreed to meet in a diner that was midway between our residences. I felt validated when I entered and found her seated at a booth. When I reached the table, she got up and gave me a hug. I didn't feel anything. It was affirmation. Before the system tore us apart, this was the lady who was meant to raise me. For hours, we sat there reviewing all of the information she had given me about my deceased biological father. She expressed her hope that I would eventually locate them and claimed he had harbored remorse over the adoption years. In addition, Karen shared with me her life following the adoption, describing how she had found it difficult to move on, but had never forgotten. In addition, she showed me a scrapbook she had preserved that had notes, photos, and even the hospital wristband from my birth. I didn't find it sentimental. It demonstrated how much she had considered me in spite of everything that had transpired. For me, meeting Karen wasn't about finding closure or healing. It was about correcting the record and obtaining answers. People had been lying to me and treating me like a tool for years. This encounter validated my preconceived notions. I wasn't saved by my adoptive parents. They were cunning individuals who took advantage of me to further their own self-interest. But what happened next caught me off guard. Karen said she had maintained contact with the social worker who had helped arrange my adoption. It seems that this individual was aware of my adopted parents' true situation from the beginning. Despite seeing warning signs, they chose to ignore them since it was more convenient than the correct thing to do. I accepted her offer to get in touch with them. I was curious as to why someone would intentionally place me in that predicament. The social worker sent me an email a week later, claiming they had no option and were only carrying out orders. It was replete with half-hearted apologies and explanations. However, their remarks just made me more irate. I have seen this pattern far too often. People taking advantage and then evading responsibility by hiding behind authoritative figures or procedures. In response to their email, I didn't reply. I didn't have to. Their feeble justifications simply made me more determined. Karen and I have been in contact ever since. Some of my biological relatives, including a handful of half-siblings I was unaware I had, have even been introduced to me. They've been friendly, which is more than my adoptive parents ever gave. It's not about creating a fantasy. Ultimately, I have severed all communication with my adoptants. They were given lengthier sentences and more charges. They send me a compensation check each month. It serves as a reminder that people are accountable for their actions, even while it is insufficient to repair the harm they have caused. I've begun reconstructing my life with that money. Every one of them serves as a reminder of what I lost and what I've had to struggle to regain. They lost everything, including their home and rep. They now had to deal with the fallout. What will I do next? I will continue to save money for my ultimate objective of home. No debts or loans associated with my name. I have time and a plan, but it may take some time. In years. For the first time, with my parents no longer pulling me down, I feel like I have power over my future. This is my first opportunity to create something tangible. It's mine, yet it's not ostentatious or theatrical. And it's the only thing that counts.